Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach, and I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Ruth Reichard. Dr. Reichard research focuses on urban history, and she's here to talk about her 2021 book, Blood and Steel, Ryan White in the City of Kokomo, Indiana. Thank you for joining me, and tell us about your book here.
Well, my book is an urban and social history that tells the story of two commodities, blood and steel, and when they intersect in Kokomo in the mid-1980s, the results are basically catastrophic. They're catastrophic for Ryan White, who contracts AIDS through basically a use of blood product to treat his hemophilia.
Yeah.
And they're catastrophic for the steel workers in Kokomo when the city's third largest employer, Continental Steel, declares bankruptcy. So we have the large forces of capitalism, commodification, disease, what becomes a pandemic. And I tell that story through the fortunes and misfortunes of one city, Kokomo.
Some people might have seen the movie Philadelphia, which was about a man who had AIDS, who was kind of rejected by his community, but that was a fictional story. This was the actual news story that was getting the most attention when the AIDS epidemic was actually happening in the 80s. And tell us why there was so much attention on Kokomo. Why not someplace in New York?
Well, Ryan White's story was unique for a couple of reasons, and it actually got international attention. He was flown all over the world to appear on television shows, even in Italy, at the height of the publicity. But what happened was most people in Ryan's situation, so a person with hemophilia, contracted HIV and then AIDS through the use of the blood products to treat their hemophilia.
Yeah.
Most people went underground because AIDS was associated with two populations that were pretty well ostracized in the US, intravenous drug users and men who had sex with men. And so even children like Ryan White kept it quiet, but the Whites were very trusting people, and they never hid Ryan's diagnosis. And so, for example, when Ryan was diagnosed in December of 1984, he was in Riley Children's Hospital in Indianapolis with a really bad case of pneumonia. And it was a type of pneumonia that was associated with AIDS. So the doctors kind of worked backwards and figured out that's what was causing his illness. And so when his teachers and friends came to visit him in the hospital, his mom, Jeannie White, shared they had just received Ryan's diagnosis because they knew it wasn't transmissible airborne, you know, and so it was safe for people to visit him in the hospital. But you know, word got out pretty quickly,
came back to Kokomo with
and
the story,
so
right?
when he was feeling better in March of that following year, 1985, over spring break, he was ready to go back to school.
Yeah.
And the school system was not sure about letting him back in school. And so at first it became, we're waiting for some guidelines from the state, we'll get back to you. In the meantime, do homeschooling. And where it really came to a head, the first time and made national news was in the summer, late July, early August of 1985. He was ready to go to school. And for a kid like Ryan, who did have hemophilia, and he had a severe hemophilia, he couldn't really do sports, and so school was his main social outlet. And he was very insistent on going back to school and living a normal life. And that's when things started to get combative, was late July, early August 1985, where the state health department, headed by Dr. Woodrow Myers, said, okay, we've got these guidelines for having kids with AIDS back in the classroom. And the Western School Corp in Rushville, which is next door to Kokomo in Howard County, said no. we're not letting you back in school.
Yeah.
We're just not comfortable. And so
Sounds like
right
the busing
away,
fiasco from the
that,
1950s. doesn't
yes,
it?
that
Yeah.
sets up the conflict. And the next day, he's on CBS This Morning. Ryan is.
Yeah.
And it made the national news literally overnight. And once the media had someone suffering from AIDS who was a quote unquote sympathetic victim, child, didn't get it through any behavior on his part other than seeking treatment for a chronic disease. The media latched on and followed his story, and everyone really across America started wondering, can he go back to school yet?
Yeah.
Can he go back?
And he eventually died at age 18, right?
Yes.
And so he was being tracked during that whole period then.
Yes.
Yeah, interesting. So just as some background, since this was in the 1980s, the situation for hemophiliacs was that they periodically need blood transfusions, and the blood that was being collected at blood banks was contaminated with AIDS.
Right.
And the people that were, the companies, the organizations that were providing the blood were denying that it was contaminated, right?
Right. Well,
And then, yeah, just straighten me out here, but I think I heard that they pretty much wiped out the hemophiliac population because of the misrepresenting.
We have to backtrack a little.
Yeah.
Before the 1960s, the treatment for hemophilia was whole blood transfusion.
Okay.
Meaning people with hemophilia, and it mostly strikes males, had to check themselves into the hospital, endure a very painful and lengthy blood transfusion, and then walk out. But
Now, for someone who isn't familiar with this, someone who has hemophilia, their blood doesn't clot or
Correct.
doesn't clot as quickly
Correct.
as it does for other people, and so they can get a small cut and then bleed to death, essentially.
or
right?
go to the dentist for a teeth cleaning and
Yeah.
have a serious problem on their
Yeah,
hands.
yeah.
Yeah, so in the 60s and 70s.
So if you get cut, then you're at a hospital and they're giving you a transfusion with some blood that they think will clot.
Yes.
Which stops the bleeding, and then you get to go home at some point, right?
Yes, in the olden days. But
Yeah.
in the 60s and 70s, there were miraculous developments in science,
Okay.
where scientists figured out that they could separate blood into its parts. So you have your red blood cells, your white blood cells, and then your plasma. And the plasma is a different kind of matter than the other part of your blood, and the plasma is where the clotting factor lives.
I see.
So the scientists figured out how to isolate the clotting factor within the plasma, and then fast forward, basically make it into an injectable treatment that
Okay.
people like Ryan in the 70s and early 80s could give themselves at home.
Okay.
And so that was revolutionary.
I'm remembering this
because-
from my youth.
Yes.
So I guess.
So
yeah.
it really was revolutionary because it lengthened the lifespan,
Sure.
and it enabled you to basically live a normal life and treat your bleeds, which is what they called it,
Yeah.
at home, your episodes. Well, the problem is, here in the United States, we pay people for donating plasma. So
Yeah.
in the 70s, the authorities started noticing that people receiving blood transfusions and blood products like Ryan and other people with hemophilia were getting hepatitis. And so by the time HIV appeared in the nation's blood supply, the federal government, the FDA, and the blood products manufacturers, the big companies, big pharmaceutical and other companies, they knew that diseases were transmissible through the blood supply.
And hepatitis was a problem at the time with people using drugs and needles, right?
Yes, sharing their needles.
And so if you've got a drug habit, you may be more likely to go make some money by donating blood, right?
Yes, because you needed cash and you could get cash out of your arm, basically. And for people who are interested in other countries, it's considered an act of altruism to donate your plasma. There's
I know
no
somebody who
payment
still
exchange.
donates blood.
Yes, and it still to this day is is an industry that thrives on, there are always going to be people who need cash.
Yeah.
And so the federal government started working with the blood products companies in the 70s to make the blood supply safer.
Yeah.
And they made them start labeling blood products, especially for hospitals, whether or not the donors were paid. And the hospitals quit using the blood that had the label from paid donors. But that was a totally different stream logistically than the stream that went toward the blood products to treat people with hemophilia with clotting factor. And so that didn't have to be labeled. And so just basically people with hemophilia, their lives were revolutionized by being allowed to treat themselves at home with the factor, and they viewed getting hepatitis as a small price to pay. Ryan had gotten it.
Yeah.
And but toward the mid-1980s, they started seeing a sticker that it could contain the AIDS virus, because the lawyers at the big laboratories that sold the blood clotting factor told them to start putting on the sticker. Well, they put on the sticker after they knew it was already in the blood supply, the blood product supply. And so in other countries, you know, in the 1990s, specifically I write about France and Japan, people actually went to prison from executives from blood products companies for continuing to use a factor that had been adulterated with the AIDS virus. But here in America, the story didn't end that way.
Right.
But basically, Ryan and a whole generation. Well, Ryan and a whole generation of people with hemophilia did die.
Yeah.
And you know, I talk about what happened at the end, late 1990s, early 2000s. The government settled with those families and survivors, what few survivors there were, and class action litigation settled. The defendants in the class action suits were 4 major blood product manufacturers and the National Hemophilia Foundation. And they were all...
in part, at least they were guilty of misrepresenting the purity of the product. Yeah.
The other thing is, in the mid-1980s, scientists figure out that you could heat treat the blood product and not kill the clotting factor, but you would kill the virus. You'd kill the hepatitis virus and the AIDS virus.
I think that would be the first thing they would try.
Yeah,
I'm surprised it took a long time, but I'm sure there was more to it than that.
By the end of the 80s, you have a whole cohort in those few years, early to mid-1980s, that got infected.
Yeah, I know of cases where doctors were refusing to give people blood transfusions, even though the procedure called for it at times.
Well, there wasn't a test for HIV till 1985. So, you know, people were operating blind in hospitals and other areas. It was a crapshoot. I call it Russian roulette in my book.
But what about Kokomo here? Here's this town in the heartland, and it's really a very kind of a post-industrial community that's going through some problems. And it's not a very nurturing, helpful environment for this kid and his family, is it?
No, Kokomo was a very successful, most of its population was gainfully employed in manufacturing. The big 3 employers were Chrysler, General Motors, and then Continental Steel, what I write about. And people were used to having a good paying job, not necessarily needing to go to college. They were all in unions associated with the manufacturing, and it was a good place to live, a good place to raise your family. It was what you think of as the heartland, with bowling leagues and a United Way that was thriving. And then deindustrialization hit in the early 1980s, and General Motors and Chrysler contracted. You know, Chrysler almost went bankrupt.
Right.
Had to be bailed out by the federal government. And
As did they all, yeah.
yes, and Continental Steel did go bankrupt. And unfortunately, this happened at the same time as the world was turning its attention to Kokomo for Ryan White's exclusion from school.
Yeah.
And so...
And this is a bit of a shock, right? Because I'm sure Ryan White and his family thought they were members of this community and they were going to be accepted.
Very much so.
Yeah.
I mean, Jeannie White...
This is not It's
yeah.
a Wonderful Life kind of
No,
environment,
Jeannie
is it?
White, his mom, grew up in Kokomo. Her dad worked at a Kroger supermarket.
Yeah.
You know, they went to the same church her whole life, and all of a sudden in church, people wouldn't shake their hands at the time. And when it was fellowship time, and when their car wouldn't start in the parking lot, nobody stopped to offer them assistance. It was very different. And, you know, we think of the Midwest and the Heartland as kind of a nurturing place, but it turned out to be not at all nurturing. I mean, people really shunned the Whites, and all of them, not just Ryan. They endured ostracism. People wouldn't wait on them at restaurants. They had their house vandalized. It was a situation where Jeannie White actually ended up moving her family out of Kokomo just because they didn't feel safe and they didn't feel welcome.
Yeah. So, but Ryan and his family are still speaking up, right? They didn't back down because of this.
Yes, they did not back down at all. It took a lot of courage every day, and when he finally was allowed back in school, which it took a court order for him finally to go to school. Of course, he endured a lot of ostracism and episodes of bullying at school, but he went every day he was well enough to go, which wasn't often, and every day when he wasn't appearing elsewhere in the country for fundraisers or things like that. But if he was healthy and he was in town, he went, knowing full well what was waiting for him.
They have kind of worked their way out of the economic downturn they were in,
yes.
right?
Yeah, they've had some good leadership, especially in the 21st century, and where Continental Steel was, it was so toxic, it was designated as a Superfund site. And so millions of taxpayers' dollars were spent to remediate that neighborhood, which is now a soccer field and a solar farm. And the only mention that there was once a colossal steel mill there is there's a bike and like a bike walk hike trail that says Steel Yard Trail. So you know there was a steel yard there at some point. But other than that, you would not know Continental Steel was there, and you would not necessarily know Ryan White was there. If you come to Indianapolis and go to the Children's Museum, you'll learn about Ryan White. But Kokomo and Western School Corp have not really done anything to memorialize Ryan.
Now, the steel industry has a sort of symbolic relationship to this too. You point out in your book that both blood and steel are commodities, and that this is a
very lucrative
an issue of the commodification of commodities. Can you explain that?
Well, we chose in America to commodify blood, and especially,
as you say, which is not the case in other countries necessarily.
Right, and so. As I mentioned to you before we went on air, a barrel of blood and plasma is worth far more times than a barrel of crude oil. It is an extremely valuable commodity because there's no synthetic replacement for it. And we see the perversion of the profit incentive in the 1980s once the blood products are suspected to be unsafe, they remain on the market. with the government's approval or looking the other way, depending on how you look at it. The same goes with steel. I mean, the people with hemophilia and the steel workers, they were victims of the commodification. The steel workers had it great when the market was great, but after World War II, the US didn't really invest in their plants like the rest of the world did. The rest of the world was bombed out because of World War II. Germany, the UK, Japan, the big steel makers, they ended up competing with the United States in the 70s and 80s. And there was a shortage of steel, but then very quickly there was a glut. And the foreign steel mills were in the best position to satisfy the need.
Yeah, they were.
And
I was.
no one wanted American steel.
Yeah, I did some consulting for Ford, and I talked to their managers in one of their plants, and they said, and these were guys that told me if I parked my Toyota in their parking lot, it was going to get damaged.
Right.
But they didn't want American steel. They wanted Japanese steel because it said the American steel wasn't as good and it messed up their machines and it shut their lines down.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just the competition. I think there was a quality issue. Probably, as you say, because of the retooling that had to happen after World War II, right?
We did not invest, we meaning America. The banks invested overseas. American banks invested in foreign steel mills, not American. The capital went abroad, and that's where the business went. And, the people in Kokomo who wanted to work, who were willing to work, were left without a job. And so within Kokomo, management pointed the finger at unproductive workers, workers pointed the finger at inept management, and, really, it was either or both. Meanwhile, the banks that didn't fund them anymore and the owners of the company, the big conglomerates, got off scot-free. I mean, the finger pointing deflected blame from the real culpability.
Yeah. Well, so how has this impacted the legacy of AIDS? I don't know if you've looked into this at all, but what do people that grew up after the epidemic, what do you think they know about it, and how has this impacted that?
Well, I'm not sure they know Ryan White's story, but AIDS right now is a chronic disease.
They might know the impact of Ryan White's story, though, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, they definitely do, because in 1990, shortly after Ryan died, the Congress passed the Ryan White CARE Act, and CARE is an acronym, but that has been funding treatment and all kinds of resources for people living with AIDS for 33 years now. And it even funds legal services for people with AIDS so that they're not discriminated against. And AIDS right now is a chronic condition. It's something you can take medicine for every day, and well, I should say HIV is a chronic condition.
Sure.
You will probably never get AIDS because you keep your HIV, you keep it under control with the medicine. It may become curable in our lifetime. That's how far things have come. But thanks to Ryan and his mother's really tireless advocacy, she did not sit around and grieve. She went straight to Washington and was an activist and got that funding passed. It was bipartisan support, and every president and Congress since 1990 has reauthorized it. So his legacy lives on through the name of that legislation, and of course at the Children's Museum.
Do you have any examples of a crisis like this that was handled well, that a community dealt with in a more humane and productive way?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head, but for most of human history, we have conflated disease and morality. So for example, in the 1830s, when we had widespread cholera epidemics because we didn't have safe drinking water, people thought, well, only bad, immoral people get sick because it happened in cities where people of all classes and races mixed, and they were viewed as not pure like the countryside. Well, really what it was the microbes were concentrated in the water supply, and so that's why people in the cities got sick. But we, even after we learned about the germ theory and things like that, we still, when AIDS appeared, we still conflated getting sick with immorality. And that really kind of painted Ryan White and his family with that brush. Even though here he is, a kid treating his hemophilia,
right.
people still refused to believe that that's how he got AIDS. And
Although
they said,
he was
well,
kind
it
of
was
a way,
his mom. Or,
he was kind of a way around that problem, at least.
Yes, I mean,
for the news media.
Right. The media and most non-reactionary people who were not coming from a place of fear accepted the explanation that he got it through a blood supply.
Yeah.
So
interesting. That's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. Ruth Reichard for joining me today on Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. I'll see you next time.